Heroes of Might and Magic 2 was first released in 1996, before online competitive multiplayer was common, and it was a time when balancing factions perfectly wasn't necessarily a priority for game designers. That made the balancing decisions in the game quite interesting, and for many people a big part of its unique charm. In this video I'll go into more detail on that, and outline key pros and cons of each faction, before giving them a ranking. Our first faction is the Barbarian, one of only two might-based factions in the game along with the Knight. Barbarians are well suited to fast-paced maps. Goblins are fairly weak starting units, but they have high growth potential, and they're actually quite efficient for their price. Barbarian heroes have the highest chance of attack increases on level up, which does make up for their low damage range. In addition, their heroes naturally start with the pathfinding skill, which can be incredibly important for making the most of those early turns. Heroes 2 isn't a game where sticking as close as possible to the roads is typically key to victory, so being able to go off course without wasting movement points is a huge factor in building momentum. Moving on to their other units, Orcs are painfully slow and fairly weak, so upgrading them to Orc Chieftains is very important. Unfortunately, the Orc Chief Dwelling upgrade does require the Adobe, which, although available right after the Stick Hut, is a little expensive in the first few turns as a result of being a tier 4 dwelling. The upgrade increases their damage from 2 to 3 to 3 to 4, raises their speed from very slow to slow, which also improves the movement points of your heroes, and increases their hit points per unit by 50%. It's a massive improvement at a very small cost, increasing their price per unit from 140 to 175. Orc Chieftains and Goblins then are a solid combination to get the ball rolling in the early game. Wolves are okay units, able to attack twice in a row, but they're also frail and vulnerable to attrition. Counterintuitively, the biggest problem with Wolves is probably the fact they're the fastest units Barbarian has. Remember that the weight function from Heroes of Might and Magic 3 doesn't exist here, so faster units will always have to attack first, before enemy units have used up their retaliation. As a result, Wolves almost always have to take retaliation before they get to use their second attack. Almost inevitably, they will take regular losses. Ogres, however, are where things get really interesting for this faction. Unupgraded, they are awfully slow, but the upgrade to Ogre Lords literally doubles their speed, increases their hit points by 50% to 60 in total, and improves their damage output. The Ogre Lord is really the backbone of this faction, still a little on the slow side, but great performers in battle with good stats across the board. Trolls and War Trolls have fewer hit points per unit at 40 each, but they do regenerate them every turn. Barbarians aren't great spellcasters, but War Trolls combined with a spell like Steelskin are excellent at absorbing damage in smaller fights. Combined with Orc Chieftains, they ensure this town is one of the better ones at attacking from range, which is incredibly important for clearing the map with minimal attrition. All of the creatures I've mentioned so far come from dwellings which only require gold, wood and ore, so Barbarians are excellent at adapting to maps with low resource variety. Ironically, that also makes it easier for them to save up the resources needed for mage guilds, though Barbarians as a hero class are less likely to get wisdom than any other class. That, by the way, can be a big problem in general, as wisdom is a requirement for most of the game's best spells. The Barbarian unique building, the Colosseum, also only costs wood, gold and ore, but its effect of providing +2 morale to siege defenders is mediocre, and it's best to save those resources for creature production. The one creature dwelling that does require special resources is the Pyramid, which costs 20 crystal. It produces Cyclops, which are solid units at first, able to attack over 2 hexes and sometimes paralyze enemies, and with the help of the well you can get up to 4 of those per week, which is one more than most other tier 6 units. But this is where the cracks start to show for this faction. While Cyclops are decent units in general, they're much weaker than some other factions' top tier units, in particular the Black Dragon and Titan. On smaller maps you can capitalize on an initial power spike when you first recruit them, but in longer games, Barbarian as a faction just can't keep up with other towns' army output. Cyclops and Ogre Lords alone won't be enough to dominate those bigger maps, so you'll need to find a way to access those stronger tier 6 units. To a degree, Barbarian units can appear deceptively strong for their stats, thanks to Barbarian's naturally high chance of gaining attack skill on level up, but that obviously comes at the cost of missing out on improved spellcasting. With that said, Barbarians can be surprisingly effective at using spells which are low cost but high impact, such as Blind for example. Ultimately though, 4 Cyclops per week just can't compete with 3 Black Dragons, Titans, or even Bone Dragons, which means this might focus town doesn't actually always produce the might potential it needs. For that reason, I'm going to put Barbarian in the B tier. Knights are the other of the two might focused factions and frankly have very similar weaknesses to Barbarians. While peasants try to make up for their terrible stats with a high growth rate, in practice it's way too difficult to build up their numbers to actually make them a threat. Their slowness reduces your hero's movement points, along with their ability to affect the outcome of battles. With that said, if you do manage to mass them up successfully, it is surprising how hard they can hit sometimes. The sad truth is that Peasant's biggest influence on the game is probably the fact that they're the perfect prey for Necromancers. The Knight does at least get immediate access to ranged units in the form of archers, but archers are both extremely slow and weak until upgraded to rangers, which are twice as fast and fire 2 shots per round. If you get rangers early, Knights do have strong early game momentum potential, as rangers have unusually high damage output for low tier units. However, they're extremely vulnerable to enemy ranged units, but your peasants won't be fast enough to shut them down. Even worse though, the upgraded archery range is only available after you build an armory and blacksmith. And the armory itself requires a tavern, which wastes an extra day of construction without being a particularly useful building. Pikemen and swordsmen are also basic walker units, and neither are particularly fast, which again means battles against ranged units can be extremely costly for this town. All of these units are reasonably priced, and smaller maps with scarce resources can actually suit knights better than almost any other town. But if gold isn't a big problem, the Knight is held back by its complete lack of flying units and overdependence on rangers for attacks from distance. Cavalry and champions are similar in that they're relatively low cost units with relatively low stats for their tier, but unlike most other Knight units, they are incredibly fast. Champions are the joint fastest units in the game alongside Phoenixes, which does provide the Knight with unbeatable spellcasting momentum. A spell like Mass Haste can enable the Knight's units to close down enemies before they can respond, and protect their vulnerable ranges in the process. Also similar to Barbarians, their tier 6 dwelling, the Cathedral, requires 20 crystal, and is the first of their dwellings to require anything other than gold, wood, and ore. Again, there's that irony that this might-based town is actually better placed to allocate its rarer resources to the Mage Guild than pretty much any other town. Paladins, like Cyclops, will grow by 4 per week, and provide the Knight with a useful power spike when first available. With their ability to attack twice in one turn and at a cost of 600 gold each, they're extremely efficient for their price, but have the lowest overall stats of all tier 6 units. As you can tell, that's kind of the theme of the town. Unlike wolves though, paladins and crusaders aren't your fastest unit, and can attack a stack after champions have already drawn out their retaliation, in order to be able to hit twice without being hit back. However, they're better at taking retaliations than champions anyway, so that's not always that useful. The upgraded cathedral is expensive, and crusaders aren't quite as good value at 1000 gold each, but that isn't really a big deal in such an otherwise gold efficient town. On top of attacking twice, crusaders are immune to curse and deal double damage against the undead, and frankly, along with rushing them early on, that's kind of your only hope against necromancers. But even crusaders only have 65 hit points each. Putting gold efficiency aside, the knights units are just simply weaker than other factions. On longer maps, crusaders can't keep up with other tier 6 units, and few of your other units can outmuscle their equal tiered rivals either. Knight heroes are actually quite well balanced in their learn sets, and usefully do come with the leadership skill by default, but the town is ultimately badly limited by its lack of flyers, which makes siege attacks difficult, and by its lack of raw power. And for that reason, I'm gonna have to put the Knight in C tier. Next up, the Necromancer is probably the most unique faction in the game. Its defining feature, the Necromancy skill, is an incredibly fun mechanic that can lead to unstoppable skeleton snowballing in the late game. It effectively flips the game on its head, often making battles against large groups of enemy units more of a reward than whatever objects they're guarding. It's important to acknowledge though that the Necromancer does have some unfortunate flaws. The early game in particular can be rough, with your first 3 creatures being basic walkers. Zombies are incredibly slow and weak, not only ineffective in battle, but also dragging down the movement points of any hero carrying them at the start of a turn. Mutant zombies are much faster, but still have a disappointing damage range of 2 to 3. It's the type of unit that could work well as a bulky meat shield for your ranged units, but the Necromancer doesn't actually get any ranged units until they reach Liches at tier 5. On top of that, unlike in Heroes 3, Liches in Heroes 2 will deal friendly fire damage against your own undead units, so placing zombies in front of them as meat shields still doesn't really work. Mummies, when upgraded to Royal Mummies, are deceptively fast and have decent stats along with their curse ability, but the 3 walking units in a row makes it very difficult to avoid attrition in the early game. And that's a real problem because while you can build a skeleton power stack, it's very momentum based and difficult to do before you have expert necromancy. Another slightly nitpicky negative of necromancers, excuse the alliteration, is that their unique building the Storm is also disappointing and only provides +2 spell power for defenders in a siege. It's very situational and low impact for its price. But if you can get past that patchy early game, the Necromancer arguably has the best late game of any faction. The skeleton snowball I've already mentioned is a huge factor, but Necromancer has some other massive advantages too. Vampire Lords in particular are borderline broken with their life drain ability, especially if you stick them in the corner of the enemy's side of the field, where only 2 melee units can reach them at once. Unlike in Heroes 3, life drain is incredibly versatile and still enables Vampire Lords to resurrect themselves against the likes of undead and so-called unliving units like Iron Golems. That actually compounds with the Necromancy skill by allowing you to take fights with minimal losses, while simultaneously protecting and maximizing your skeleton power stack. Necromancer's tier 6 units Bone Dragons are also very good. Although they are significantly weaker than Black Dragons and Titans despite the same growth rate, 3 Ghost Dragons will still outperform 4 Cyclops or 4 Crusaders on average, while conveniently only costing 1,500 gold each. Technically, Crusaders will deal double damage against Bone Dragons in a 1 vs 1 matchup, but that's not actually enough to make up for their overall weaker stats and lack of versatility. Bone Dragons and Vampire Lords make a great combination in a kind of hammer and anvil maneuver, able to attack enemies anywhere on the field, and despite Bone Dragons having 150 hit points each, they're actually best used as the hammer in these situations because Vampire Lords are so much tankier thanks to their life drain. The upgraded mansion for Vampire Lord access can be expensive on smaller maps requiring 10 crystal, 10 gems and 3000 gold, but like most things Necromancer, it becomes less of a limitation in those longer games. Finally, the Necromancer as a hero class is relatively well balanced, with good access to secondary skills and a relatively balanced distribution between the different primary skills. While I do think their early game limitations are often overlooked, Heroes of Might and Magic 2 was the game that introduced the Necromancer, and the Necromancer's status as a late game skeleton massing powerhouse is probably one of the most famous features of the entire Heroes series. The Necromancer is iconic, and for that incredible snowballing potential, I think they definitely belong in the S tier. The Sorceress is not one of the game's more popular factions, but does have some interesting advantages. Their starting units, Sprites and Dwarves, make for a bit of a weird combination as they're both melee attackers on opposite ends of the maneuverability spectrum. Like zombies, Dwarves have a negative effect on your hero's movement points and feel lackluster in battle with no range stack to protect. However, once upgraded, Battle Dwarves are twice as fast and actually pretty useful as early game tanks, as well as having a 25% chance to resist enemy spells. They combine well with your next 2 units, Elves and Druids, which are both high damage but low hit point range units. This is the stage of the game where the Sorceress starts to come into its own, with Battle Dwarves providing a protective blocker for your range units against enemy walkers, while even a stack of 1 Sprite can block enemy range units for a turn without being a meaningful loss. Sprites can attack without retaliation, but you need to use them carefully because they're painfully frail and easy targets. It's often best to hold them back until later in a battle, so you can throw them in to finish off isolated enemy units. The problem of course is that at the start of the game, you kind of need to make use of them as it takes a little bit longer to get your other units going. That means the Sorceress is really more comfortable in the mid-game. The Grand Elf and Greater Druid upgrades are mostly useful for the higher speed, but otherwise don't make too much difference. The tier 5 unit is the Unicorn, which is an okay all-rounder, partly thanks to its ability to cast blind when it attacks sometimes, but at 40 hit points each, they're not anywhere near as tanky as they are in Heroes 3. And that's one of the big problems with this town. It can dish out damage fairly well, but it provides a much lower amount of hit points per week than other towns, and only really Battle Dwarves and to some extent Phoenixes are actually comfortable taking hits. Phoenixes have 100 hit points each, significantly less than the tier 6 creatures of the Wizard, Warlock and Necromancer, but are similarly limited to growth of 3 per week if you have a well. Phoenixes do have some other abilities that can help make up for that. They're the joint fastest units in the game along with champions, and as flyers they can shut down enemy range units instantly, as well as giving you the ability to cast your first spell instantly. Like dragons, they can attack over 2 hexes, and they're also immune to elemental spells. In particular, you can give a hero just Phoenixes and nothing else, and they can cast Elemental Storm as much as they like, with no fear of damaging their own units. That combination can be used in very cheesy ways if you like to play like that. For example, if you have enough gold and a good spellcaster near a threatened town, you can attack an invader with a single Phoenix, cast Elemental Storm, and then immediately surrender. You should get your movement points back in this game, so you can repeat the process until you're all out of gold or out of spell points. I personally try not to play like that, but to each their own. Sorceress heroes start with a navigation skill, which is of course extremely powerful on water maps, but completely useless on land maps. Being forced to have that skill regardless of map type is definitely unfortunate. The unique building, the Rainbow, is also underwhelming, providing +2 luck to defending heroes, which is highly situational. Overall, the Sorceress is in a bit of a weird spot. The early combination of Sprites and Dwarves isn't great for building momentum, and in the late game their low total HP output and Phoenix's lack of raw power relative to Dragons and Titans means they struggle to keep up there as well. But they do have decent options available to them throughout most maps, and can be the best option on some maps, particularly medium-length ones or maps which include lots of water. I'd say this is definitely a B-tier town, and the stronger faction between Sorceress and Barbarian is heavily map-dependent, but for scaling better into the late game, I would rank the Sorceress marginally higher. Moving on, our next faction is the Warlock, and let's start with the early game. Although both limited by a middling damage range, Centaurs and Gargoyles are an instantly strong combination. Gargoyles are exceptionally fast early game flyers, well suited to splitting into one stacks and closing the gap on enemy range units before they can harm your Centaurs, as well as forming a meat shield or working as bait against melee units. They aren't the bulkiest tier 2 units, but they aren't that frail either. Also, as fast units, they're excellent choices to leave with your scout heroes, and maximize your movement points in the next turn, although Centaurs are fairly speedy as well. Careful use of Gargoyles can make it easy to hold on to a strong stack of Centaurs, which should be your go-to choice for a power stack to efficiently take early battles. Griffins can't match Gargoyles for speed, but with unlimited retaliations and 25 hit points, which is above average among tier 3 units, they're arguably even more effective at shutting down groups of enemy range units, and they're also a great choice to send over enemy walls during siege battles. Unusually, Minotaurs and Minotaur Kings are your first basic walking melee units, but they have very good combat stats and enough speed when upgraded to fit into the rapid and aggressive theme of the town. Hydras are a less natural fit, as their terrible speed stat will significantly reduce your carrying hero's movement points and make it harder to involve them in battle. Some players would argue they're best left as town defenders, and it is true they're incredibly effective at holding out defensively with their multi-attacks and their massive 75 hit points each, which is higher than Crusaders and comparable to Cyclops despite being a tier below them. However, I do personally think they can be worth keeping around for tougher fights on the adventure map, especially against rival heroes. They're excellent at defending your Centaurs in particular, although of course you can only bring 5 of your 6 unit types into any battle, and they are a simple choice to leave behind. If you do bring them, just make sure you leave them on less important heroes at the end of the turn, as doing so is incredibly important to preserve your main hero's movement points. Finally, and most famously, you have green, red, and black dragons, and the only creature dwelling in the game you can upgrade twice. They are very expensive, but that's understandable for the strongest units in the game. And that also brings me onto their unique building, the Dungeon, which provides you 500 gold per day. It's not cheap at 3000 gold, 5 wood, and 10 ore, but it's hard to overstate what a massive difference it can make. Bear in mind that in Heroes 2, a basic town will provide 500 gold per turn, while a town with a castle provides 1000. Add on the 250 gold from the statue, and you can expect a typical town to provide 1250 gold per turn. So it goes without saying that a Warlock town with a dungeon enjoys a massive increase in its gold income in percentage terms, nearly 50%, bringing them up to 1750 per turn. So while dragons are expensive, Warlock in general is far better equipped to sustain an expensive army than any other faction. So they have no major weaknesses in the unit lineup, and they're also unmatched in their economy. You have to get a bit nitpicky to find fault with this faction, but we can try. The Warlock hero class isn't particularly great, starting with scouting isn't ideal for a main hero for example, and they're biased towards spell power on leveling up, which also isn't always ideal. Interestingly, the Warlock can learn Necromancy as a skill, which I personally think is a fun option, but it is very situational. Of course, nothing is stopping you from recruiting a hero of another class, and using that as your main if you have the gold. Overall, the Warlock faction is borderline flawless, and one of the main reasons people say the game isn't balanced. They won't always be the best option, in particular the Necromancer can build momentum faster than them on some maps, but I would say this is the most reliably good faction, and I'm going to place it right at the top of S tier. Last but not least, we have the Wizard. Wizards have 2 very unique and satisfying advantages. Firstly, the library grants them access to 1 extra spell per level of Mage Guild, which among other things potentially doubles their chances of getting the best level 5 spells. And secondly, they're the only faction in the game with built-in access to 3 different range units. Unlike in Heroes 3, ranged penalties don't apply when shooting across the normal battlefield, which makes the Wizard uniquely good at clearing the map of slow-moving melee units, which is the most common class of enemy units there is. Boars are decent all-rounder units, fast enough to rapidly close the gap on enemy range units, but also tanky enough to serve as meat shields around your halfling power stack. Meanwhile, although Iron Golems are too slow to recommend bringing on your main hero, Golems in general being slow tanky units are an obvious choice to protect your various range units. In a final battle scenario, their resistance to magic damage can also provide added insurance against mages with spells like Chain Lightning or Armageddon. Your tier 4 units Rocks are solid flying units that are tanky enough in the early game to be excellent counters to enemy range units. Stacks of individual Rocks have 40 hit points each and can fly anywhere on the field from the first round. As a result, they can easily fly over to weaker range units like Orcs or Rangers, and protect your halflings so they can safely attack from distance. Mages are also solid all-around range units, but while their lack of melee penalty helps patch up the wizard's obvious weaknesses in close combat, at 30 hit points each they are vulnerable to enemy retaliations and still best kept at distance. Upgraded Archmagi are the same, although they do have 5 extra hit points, but they also come with better stats, a 20% chance to remove beneficial spell effects from enemy units, and are recruited from the upgraded Ivory Tower, which is far cheaper than the original dwelling. Finally, Titans are easily the strongest ranged units in the game, immune to mind spells like Blind, and thanks to no melee penalty almost just as effective up close. Black Dragons will beat them 1 versus 1 despite costing 1000 gold less per unit, but unlike Black Dragons, Titans can be resurrected and aren't locked behind a double dwelling upgrade. All of this is to say the wizard has tools to perform well at all stages of the game, so you might be wondering what the catch is. Unfortunately, this town does have some major drawbacks. Firstly, the cost of the Ivory Tower dwelling for mages is brutal. For 5 of each precious resource, it's the exact same cost as the library, plus an additional 2,500 gold for a total of 4,000. The Ivory Tower, Library, and Mage Guild are all extremely useful to wizards, but also all competing for the exact same resources. On top of that, the Ivory Tower is required for the Cloud Castle, meaning you'll often have to prioritize buying it, even if it means you end up playing a wizard who avoids constructing a Mage Guild. Speaking of the Cloud Castle, with the base dwelling and its upgrade costing 12,500 gold and 20 gems each, you'll need to find even more riches to make the best of this town. And you will want the upgraded version, not just because giants can't attack from range and titans can, but also because on many maps it's better to avoid recruiting giants altogether. Giants can be a good option on smaller maps when you don't need titans, because they only cost 1,500 gold and 1 gem each, meaning their stats and cost are similar to bone dragons and phoenixes. But Heroes 2 is not Heroes 3, and in this game, upgrading a unit costs double the cost difference between the unit and its upgrade. Titans cost 5,000 gold and 2 gems, a huge increase, to the point where upgrading a giant to a titan at that double cost requires 6,000 gold and 2 gems. That means it's more expensive than buying an extra titan outright. Especially on impossible difficulty where precious resources are scarce, finding the resources you need to reach your potential as this town is incredibly challenging. Finally, despite being the faction with the most range units, wizards unfortunately have one of the lowest chances of being offered the archery skill. On a rich map where you have the resources you need to properly reach your potential, the wizard can actually compete with warlocks and necromancers at any stage of the game. But with expensive dwellings, no equivalent to the dungeon to patch up your gold income, and that expensive upgrade from giants to titans, it's frustratingly easy to hit a bottleneck as this town, and for that reason I just don't think they're as reliable as the S tier factions, even though they are probably my favourite late game town. For that reason, I'm going to slot them in at A tier. Overall, this game is definitely very imbalanced, but even here the tier rankings do feel like a bit of a crude measure, as every town can excel in different situations. And yes, that is my way of telling you you're missing all the nuance if you skip to the end. If you don't own Heroes 2 and you'd like to try it, I will leave my GOG affiliate link in the description where you can buy the game and support the channel at the same time. I'm mostly using the F Heroes 2 version in this video, and I have a separate video with more info on that if you're interested. For example, it adds widescreen resolution options and other quality of life features. Finally, I am planning to make more Heroes 2 videos, so do subscribe if that's your thing. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.